record to. Thanks everyone for joining. I will be admitting some more people as we go along, but thanks for joining this webinar organized by Southern Plains Land Trust. For those of you who are not familiar with Southern Plains Land Trust, we are a nonprofit organization in southeastern Colorado. We protect native prairie wildlife. We have a number of preserves protecting about 60,000 acres of native grassland with bison, pronghorns, prairie dogs, all the native flora as well. And we got in touch with Daniel Curry here, the only other person who has their camera on. Oh no, there's Karen, who's also got her camera on. Daniel is to my left on the Zoom screen, and I'll give him a short introduction before we switch to a short little video about his nonprofit. And then the floor is all open for Daniel's story and Q&A. So Daniel Curry is a range rider. What that means, to my knowledge so far, is that he protects the interest of both predators and humans. That's why he's called Griph, because it's the guardians guarding the respective interests of predators and humans, which means that he has found a solution to deal with conflict between large predators such as wolves or other carnivores and humans, mostly rangers. Ranchers, sorry, rangers, maybe also rangers, but ranchers. He started a nonprofit organization called Project Griph after working with wolves for 20 years, as he realized that not only wolves in sanctuaries needed his attention and protection, but also wolves in the wild. He's based out of Washington State, but works all over the western states of the United States. Yeah, and I think what I'm really curious to hear about Daniel's story is how he spotted a problem between humans and wildlife, and he created a solution to help them not only coexist but co-thrive. And I'm going to share my screen because there's a beautiful little 8-minute mini documentary that kind of explains the start of his nonprofit. Let's see if this is going to go well, because I think I'm sharing my screen and then I'm keeping my sound on, so you can also hear the sound through my screen. But if everyone else can just keep themselves muted for now, I think that would work best. And please let me know if you do not hear anything or something, like just give me a shout. Let's see.
You see in the movies, cowboys are depicted as generally men. There are people that are out in the landscape and they're eating beans, watching their herd and making sure that predators don't attack them. It's a cow and wolf protecting cowboy. So instead of pulling out a rifle to deal with that wolf, it's a cowboy that pulls out something else before lethal is ever grabbed. Almost damp from our last ride, buddy. Hey, buddy. So everything on the southern aspect of that, everything we can see east of us, this is all part of the federal grazing allotment. For me, the first time I saw it, it was like, well, this just doesn't look like a place where I would normally see cows. There's 2 packs in there, probably consisting of 10 wolves, somewhere in that chunk of land with 150 cattle. A lot of space to cover, especially for one guy and his horse. Very good boy. For all of my 20s, I spent working with wolves in captivity. I was the lead animal care for Wolf Haven. It's a world-renowned wolf sanctuary. Being in close proximity to wolves like that is something that's kind of ineffable in a way. When you look at a wolf, you really see that primal aspect of what we used to be too, and like a life that a lot of us really crave still. I kept hearing about all these horrible things that were happening to wolves. They were getting killed quite regularly in my home state. I just felt like I needed to do something for wild wolves. Took a map of Washington. I found out where all the wolf packs were located. I was like, okay, they're all up in this northeast corner. And I so literally was like, I kind of connected the dots and drew a circle. And I was like, I'm going to go in the middle of all those guys that need help. Majority of the people live on the west side where there's very little wolf activity. 70% of the population love wolves, and there's really no cattle ranching. Then you come over to the east side, the majority of the population does not like wolves. Once wolves learn how to hunt cattle, it can become a real problem. Get out, boy. You did well on your ride. Yes, you did. In the 1930s, we eradicated the species from the landscape for our own personal needs. Oh no. They're only in a fraction of their home range where they used to be. Wolves recovering in some of their areas has been a great success story in many ways for the endangered species program. They invoke a very passionate response on either end of the spectrum generally. So they get relisted, and that federal protection does offer some protection, even though there's still poaching that goes on. We often see wolf recovery as a number that we have to meet, and then we're good, right? And it's like, nah, I don't believe that. I think wolf recovery happens when we've cultivated that want for the community to have wolves in the landscape. This culture needs help, and these animals need help, and they both deserve to be out here. I really feel kind of like I'm right where I need to be. What's up, big fella? Haven't seen you in a while. Yeah, so sometimes I'll just spend time with the herd like this just to help them acclimate to my presence. Okay. Throughout the whole day, you're just constantly on. You have to be aware of what's going on around you. You have to be ready for kind of anything to happen. So in order to find out what they're eating, you obviously have to get into the core of this. It's really a bad thing when you break those scats open and you actually find a bunch of cow hair. If we see that, we're like, okay, they're continuing to come back here. And why is that? And how can we kind of maybe disrupt that behavior or outright change it? My job is to scare the heck out of them and associate that fear with the cattle and myself. I want to howl, see if they respond. Right. Sorry, guys, for the curative. My mistakes is fuck. Loud noise, guys. We just got done putting some pressure on them just because they're in some private land areas and they're right adjacent to houses. And that sounded like the whole family unit. Let's regroup back out here. You're how far down there? We did disrupt them. They broke. Oh, there's one right there. See him? Right in the road. All right, I gotta scare him though. He's looking at us too much. I'm gonna put some fear of humans in him, or else somebody will take a shot at one of those guys like that. Little buddy's just running down the road. You can tell he's just this year's young. He doesn't know what to do. For me, that's way too close to human activity. That's way too much potential for conflict. So I think we made a good impact on that. That was actually a positive thing to counter them with that. That could also have saved that whole pack's life right there. That one encounter. At the end of the day, the alternative of them dying because they killed my friend's cows, that's not an acceptable alternative. So I have to scare them. These fates are intertwined. I don't think that the wolf conflict is really about wolves. I think it's a disconnect problem. Rural Americans are disconnected. City dwelling Americans, they're just nervous that this lifestyle that they're trying to pass on to the next generation in this ever-changing world, it's just gone. It's going to disappear. We have much more in common than what we do differently. And I think the world's in dire need of that. And wolves are a good example of how we can learn that as humans.
All right. Well, sorry if that was a bit glitchy. There's also a huge storm hanging above the Eastern Plains. So I'm just gonna copy the link into the chat here so people can watch the video right after the webinar. Sorry. I hope parts of it were okay. And otherwise, Daniel can do his whole, this was more like a teaser, right? Because we have Daniel right here, live in action. Daniel, would you be able to share your story with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Judith, and thank you everybody for showing up and being a part of this. I really appreciate the Southern Plains Land Trust's work and what you guys are doing, and I just am really honored to be here tonight. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, I'm really interested to hear how you started all this. Like you basically said you worked with wolves for 20 years. How did you get into that field, and what was your calling?
Yeah, so yeah, I've been working with wolves for a little over 22 years now. I started and ran the first human wildlife conflict mitigation business in Washington State using non-lethal methods. And then last year, I actually founded the nonprofit that you mentioned. Thanks for mentioning that, Project Griph, to scale these services up to the Western US, and in states like Colorado, Oregon, California, states where we're having a lot of conflict. So I guess that same motivation to scale this up and to offer this as an option as a service, to help basically bridge a gap between humans and animals and humans to humans as well. That same kind of fire in me to start it in that large scale is what started in the smaller scale. And I guess what I mean by that is I kept seeing issues arise that were costing wolves their life, costing ranchers potentially their culture and their livelihood. And then on top of that, as taxpayers, we're paying an exorbitant amount of money to watch the system fail. And I just felt like that with there being that many loses, there must be opportunities for growth and looking at the subject in a different way that maybe is more beneficial to everybody. So I was, for better or worse, literally plotted every wolf pack in Washington that's, point in time in 2012, put my finger in the middle of that circle that it created and found a little town called Colville. That's a town that I live near, and moved up here to just help, basically. I had no concept of what I was going to do in the beginning. It was just kind of, unsure of how to kind of go about this situation to take it from a critical issue to something more positive. And that's kind of what I've been focusing on, is really looking at bigger picture solutions that offer a sustainable answer that will benefit not just the ranchers and the ranching community in rural America, but the wolves that have such, in my mind and in the minds of many others and hearts of many others, such an important role to play on our world and our planet. They have an intrinsic value to fill an environmental niche. Morally, I think we're kind of at a point in human evolution where we need to start looking at these animals in a different light. And I think it's our obligation to help, kind of them step back into their roles as, stewards of this land as well. Because at the end of the day, we're stewards of the land, but so are these animals. I mean, they're the ones who are living directly on that, using that landscape. So that's kind of just a little nutshell version of how I started it. And then it just kind of progressed from there. In the beginning, there was no demand. Nobody was really expressing any interest in it, especially with my background coming from working with wolves in captivity. And now it's the opposite. I cannot supply the demand that I'm seeing in my home state and other states. And that's something that I really want to help address. So does that kind of answer your question, Judith?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it's a very noble cause. And like I said, a solution to a problem that keeps occurring. So that's amazing. And I guess one of the and I'll leave space for people to ask questions as well as soon as I'm done with my questions. No, just kidding. um, Everyone, feel free to like raise your hand on the chat or put your question in the chat or just unmute yourself. But um, I was wondering, like, how do you get in touch with these ranchers or landowners? Like, how do you get more and more people to use your services, basically?
Sometimes getting in touch and making those initial interactions and connections are a little bit complicated. Depends on what state you're dealing with. Some states really hold their cards close, and don't really like to have those connections released. Like I've had help in other states, so where state agency personnel are like, "Hey, we're at capacity. We can't really address this issue in at the caliber that it needs to be," and that's not speaking negatively about them, but they're like, "Yeah, we need help. There's no way that, two conflict mitigation specialists can cover an entire state." So they've, like in Oregon, for instance, there's a great guy there. He's helped me put me in touch with ranchers out there and contact with them and connect with them and find out what's going on the ground and how we can help. So the main issue with that is always finding enough funding to actually establish a program that produces the results that we all want, which is, I mean, our main goal, whether you're a rancher, in my opinion, from what I've seen, and I mean, I've worked with ranchers now very intimately, very like close knit for over 12 years. And at the end of the day, they don't want to have the conflict, and neither do the wolf advocates, people that really appreciate wolves in the ground. That's the common denominator that I like to work with, is like, hey, none of us really want this conflict. And in my mind, conflict is a choice, from what I've seen in actions taken or in some cases inactions. So it just depends on, to answer your question, how do I get in touch with those ranchers? It just depends on the scenario. But I mean, I've gone, my favorite way is just literally walking up and knocking on doors and just saying, "Hi, my name's Daniel. Nice to meet you. Here's what I can do for you," and just discussing and having that genuine human connection without kind of a top-down guidance approach. Because I think it's so critical, especially nowadays, for the very divisive subjects that we're facing in many fronts. That's something that I wanted to touch bases. Like you're like, it's such a critical job, but it's like this job is also, it's very indicative of many other things. Like when we have a issue as humans, we like to polarize that issue a lot of the times, because then if if I feel like I'm right, there must be a wrong, and then I can like solidify my stance. And that's something that I really don't like to focus on. So, and I can go off on tangents all night. So please kind of keep reining me in. So there's lots of information. It's a super passionate subject that I've obviously dedicated, well, over half my life to. So.
And are you able to offer your services like free of charge, or do a lot of ranchers feel like there's a negative side to having your services?
No, I think at the beginning there was definitely some stigmas that I had to kind of jump over those hurdles, and just some, I think people are a little apprehensive at first to talk about how to coexist with something that could be detrimental to their whole culture. So in the beginning there was those hurdles, but no, now I mean, I have, I have the honor of calling these ranchers that I work with dear friends, not just clients or anything. But yeah, it is free of service to them because they don't have the financial capacity. And as you can imagine, if you're like, hey, I know this thing's super scary and it might just totally wipe your whole culture off, your fifth generation ranch, but can you pay an extra giant amount of money to help us exist with them? And they're like, no, I don't. So my goal is to offer a third party service to kind of pull that strain, that extra work level off of the ranchers, also off of the state, agencies, because really neither of those, whether you're talking about, a ranch community or a state agency, they just really don't have the capacity to deal with this again at the level that we're going to need on the ground to see results that everybody's looking for. So, and that's no fault of their own. Ranching's a really hard job already. It's a demanding job. It takes many hours. You can't really expect to then throw out another 12 to 18 hour range riding shift on them. That's just an impossibility. And the same thing goes for the state agencies, in my opinion. So
Yeah, it sounds like there are no, I mean, you're removing all the barriers for them to kind of use your help, right? So
yeah.
yeah, I'm hopeful that more and more people will contract you and the range riders you deploy. We have a question from Deborah. Does Deborah want to ask it herself or just in the chat? The chat says, "Are many of the new range riders as tolerant of wolves as you are?"
I don't know which range riders you're referring to, Deborah, so I can't really answer that question, I guess. I think, let me speak to the range riders that I work with and that I could go hire more of tomorrow as soon as I find the funding. And the ones that I currently do work with are very solution oriented. To be biased on one side or the other, whether you're completely pro wolf or completely pro rancher, isn't going to maybe produce the results that I'm looking for. Because really, at the end of the day, I moved to Northeast Washington to save wolves, and I really quickly realized that their fate is intertwined with public land and private land ranching. So for me, like, I don't want somebody out there that's biased on either side. I want fence riders, so to speak. I want people that are going to look at that and say, "Hey, this isn't a choice of one or the other. This is if we look at it as a choice, we're forcing our minds to then choose one." And that's something that I think is really setting us up for failure in many ways. So if we could just say, "Hey, both of these, entities, whether it's wolves or whether it's a ranch community or just rural America at large, can be on the same landscape. They can share it and they can go beyond coexistence and they can thrive." So I don't know which new range riders you're talking in regards to, Deborah. If you could clarify that, maybe I could speak better to that.
I guess I'm talking about the new ones that have been, that you might work with a rancher who's hired a different range rider and maybe you've met them or any of that. By the way, I met you when you came to Colorado Springs.
Yeah, I remember you. Yeah, it was really nice to meet you.
Yeah, we went out to lunch at that golf course.
That
Which
was so weird to be at a golf course. But yes, I do remember that.
yeah, but no, it's just that I'm aware that you've done some consulting, and I thought you'd done consulting with ranchers who were possibly getting range riders subsidized by other, parks and wildlife, whether it was Colorado or Washington. So I thought maybe you'd met several of them, and you kind of had a feeling or a gauging of their tolerance for wolves.
Yeah, and I think in Washington I can speak more to that. I haven't really done any consultation for directly range riders specifically in Colorado. I've talked to ranchers, I've talked to like the local caucus of the pre-release or at the original release site. Done some talks down there with some groups like Colorado Wild, actually Reiner, and he's been an instrumental part of that. So, but the range riders in Washington, a lot of the times, let's put it this way, I'm trying to remain diplomatic, but be, honest and open. I think when we really throw the power and the full implementation of non-lethals to a rancher that's experiencing conflict, that's then going to maybe hire their own range riders from their own family or close friends, you might be setting that up for potential problems down the road for the ranch, for the wolves and for others because there might be a bias there. I'm not saying there is, but I mean, I know I can speak to Washington range riders. Like we've had two range riders last year in Washington that were state funded shoot wolves that were caught in the act. And I do that air quote because there's really no way to prove that. And again, when you're saying, hey, I know you don't like these animals, I know maybe you don't see a point for them to be on the landscape, but we're going to put all the power to protect them and to help you exist in the landscape with them in your hands. I mean, I think that that doesn't put our best foot forward to help preserve the cultures and these animals in the best way that we can. Um, so for those folks that are range riding that are shooting wolves caught in the act, I think, yeah, they're probably not too tolerant of wolves. And that's something that isn't going to be long-term sustainable solution based or any kind of, it's not positive. I mean, if we just continue to kill these animals, we're going to continue that cycle. And that's what we've seen in many states, including my home state. And yeah, so regarding CPW range raiders, I have not met one of them. So I heard that there was a handful that were hired, and I've heard a little bit about their program, but I don't know if does that answer your question, Deborah?
Yes, it does. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, of course.
I see some questions in the chat, but I would like to ask a little bit more of a general question because maybe not everyone knows exactly what a range rider does. Would you be able to explain a little bit more about you've got environmental deterrence and physical deterrence. How do you prioritize? What do you do? Like, what does a day look like?
Yeah, that's a hard one to answer. I always get like, yeah, well, what's your 9 to 5 look like? I'm like, hey, it doesn't start at 9, it doesn't end at 5. That's a big difference in most people's viewpoints on that. And that's actually not how all range riders operate, though, or not how all conflict mitigation specialists for state agencies operate. A lot of the times they start at 9 and end at 5, and that's when we need them the most, is after that time frame. That's what I've encountered on the landscape here. So I will give you a definition kind of like what I consider range riding. It differs greatly from what a lot of quote unquote mainstream range riding is being offered in other areas. But so for me, my range riders of Project Griph will go out in the landscape, spend long stints of time in the landscape, acting as a buffer between livestock and human interests and large carnivores. So a lot of range riders that I've seen in Washington, I know that they do this in Arizona. I know that they do it in a lot of places, and I've been told that they've done that a little bit in Colorado. Is they'll do the drive-through method. That's where they're driving into an allotment that may be many thousands of acres and looking at a small portion of it, and then going home and checking the box saying I did some range riding, and that's something that, in my opinion, that's not range riding. That's driving around in a truck for a few hours in the middle of the forest, not being effective and wasting taxpayers' money. But for me, it's only range riding when we're out there effectively looking at the landscape in a way that we're trying to prevent conflict. We're trying to truly stop the war, not win a fight. And what I mean by that, I guess, is trying to find a solution that will benefit the ranch, the cattle, the wolves, and the environment all in one, instead of just being out there and maybe just trying to benefit the ranch, or maybe just being out there and just trying to benefit the wolves. So at this point, I don't even remember the original question because I get up on all these tangents. So I hope that I answered it.
Well, it's just it's such a different world from how I grew up. I grew up in a city, so everything's like a big adventure to me. But when do you choose to? You've got like light flares, you've got audio deterrence, you've got your
Yeah.
So,
So
so,
there's
so, like, yeah, what kind of methodology do you apply?
So those kind of like passive deterrents like you just described, like yeah, there's things like, pyrotechnics, there's things like ambient like light stimulators, like it can be even as simple as like a motion detector we've used, like battery operated motion lights that usually are there to illuminate, in front of the garage when you pull up. But you put those out in the middle of the forest and an animal walking by, they'll trigger that and they're like, what the hell is that? And why the hell is it out in the middle of nowhere? So, I mean, when you look at what you're doing is basically looking at the natural behavior of these animals and trying to disrupt maybe some behaviors that could potentially lead them into trouble and create conflict with people. So we do utilize passive deterrents like flattery, fox lights, flares. I mean, I've even hung like battery operated radios out in calving pastures. Simple things like that. Now, those generally are only used like private land or smaller operations where there's an infrastructure like fencing and buildings that we can, run power from or actually link, fladry along a fence. If you were just to put fladry out in 30,000, in a 30,000 acre federal grazing allotment, that's not really going to be effective. I mean, first of all, you can't fladry the whole thing. Second of all, I mean, it constantly needs maintenance. You're going to have a tree fall on it. It's going to delete the whole efficacy of that tool. So, I mean, some tools have a time and a place and except for range riding, that's the one tool that I can honestly say can blanket cover a lot of these, whether it's private, small, large, public, it doesn't really matter. Boots and hooves on the ground, basically acting as a okay, so let's back this up. A lot of the efforts that are going out in the landscape right now are currently very reactive, and that's not the most productive way. I mean, at that point, the problem's already been experienced. The rancher's already social tolerance is going down. The wolves are now maybe potentially habituated to that. So reaction to this issue is not the best foot forward to produce what we want, and that's co-thriving. We want to foster an environment that everybody can kind of thrive in the same landscape. So for me, it's kind of a dynamic resource on the ground that can guide the process instead of react to it. If we can actually, like, I don't know if anybody who's worked with animals has probably heard the saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that is like you cannot hold on to that more in this job. I mean, if we can prevent them from ever looking at livestock as a food source, then we don't have the problem. And that's something that, I mean, even in generally speaking, Colorado, we're not seeing that. Like we just saw very little preventative maintenance go in during the 2024 season. I think somewhere in the effect of like $48,000, two installments, one of 28 to go towards range riding. And now I think the commission just okayed a $343,000 compensation for two ranchers that experienced that problem. So from my brain is like, if we actually put 2/3 of that $343,000 into a program before wolves were ever on the ground, like I was trying to help guide that process. That's what we need as a community of whether it's in Colorado, whether it's in Oregon, whether it's in Washington, whether it's in Idaho. We need that whether you're a wolf or we need that whether you're a rancher. We need something preventing this conflict from taking place at all versus watching the conflict happen and then dumping tons of money on it. That's completely unsustainable. And I think you don't need me here to say that that's not what anybody wants. I mean, those ranchers have now experienced a problem, even though they've been compensated for it. And then now you've, kind of brought to the table a potential argument of, is that proper compensation? Why did we compensate that much? Instead of, we could have just prevented that conflict. That's what I'm shooting for.
Yeah, I like the fact that you're emphasizing like prevention is better than the cure, and also it's not one size fits all for every ranch, right? You go to the place,
Correct.
you see what works or what would work, and you apply your
Absolutely, Judith. Yeah. There is
and
no cookie cutter process to this, and we really have to give the
exactly.
respect to the animals and the ranchers to actually gauge each individual operation and say, well, what do you want? I mean, that was my first steps when moving up here is like, well, what do you want? What do you envision? And what are your main concerns? And how can I offer a service that helps kind of eliminate that concern and eliminate that conflict so that maybe you can view these animals in a different way. And that's something that's really beautiful when you can help somebody go from there's no light at the end of this tunnel, the only good wolf is a dead wolf, to them being able to look at these animals in a different capacity and in a different perspective and actually maybe gain some appreciation for them. Because I mean, I'll totally defend a rancher on that one. It's hard to look at a wolf positively if you're experiencing conflict and watching them potentially devastate your family's legacy. Now, on the other flip side of that, if you don't have that conflict, there's no reason to look at these animals with such hatred or such a visceral reaction. You can actually go, well, what is a wolf about, So,
Yeah. Yes. Do you? So you probably know a little bit about what the situation is in Colorado right now.
yeah.
Um, can you elaborate a little bit from your point of expertise, like how does it differ? What's going on in Colorado right now, and could you like maybe briefly elaborate on that for the crowd versus how Washington deals with wolf conflicts?
Well, it just depends. Like large scale, there's not that much difference, right? We actually had one of the worst years ever in 2024 for wolves, Washington wolves. Like I mentioned, there was two state-sponsored range riders that had shot and killed wolves. There was areas where there was no real non-lethal on the ground, and we were still experiencing conflict, obviously. And then we'd go in there and lethally remove them. And I mean, I'm currently even experiencing on a ranch now that we've had no issues, the repercussions of lethal removal. When we took 2 packs, he has 3 packs around him, and 2 packs were almost devastated. And now we have the remnants of each pack coming together, forming like an aggregate pack going, two of the only members of one of the packs are little pups, and they're just kind of joining another pack going, we don't have anybody. And now they're exhibiting behaviors that are most likely going to get them into trouble if we cannot curtail that behavior. So not much difference off the cuff, except for the small, like successful pockets, that I was describing with some of the ranchers that I work with that I know of. But in Colorado, I mean, I guess what I wish in an ideal world is that, I mean, when I went and testified at a commission meeting, the chair, the Colorado Wildlife Commission, really good guy, asked me a really, pointed question. He's like, Mr. Curry, thank you for coming out. Do you think we would have had do you think it would have been beneficial to have had a service like what you're describing right now that you could offer on the landscape before wolves were ever here? And I was like, that's a beautiful question. I mean, honestly, I think we'd be having a much different conversation of how we've succeeded. So again, that's kind of taken a reactive process. We put wolves out there, and then we started to try and build a range riding program, and then there was a little bit of effort there. $48,000 is not much effort, especially when there was enough available budget to really throw some, in my opinion, some quality non-lethals on the ground to really help that community, both wolves and ranchers, kind of jump into this prepared, jump into this with some backup. At this point, it feels like, I mean, I don't think it's going to go super well, to be frank. When you have 2 range riders per county, that's a huge amount of area to cover. When that's only looking at it as a 5-month block, that's ignoring the rest of the year. Wildlife doesn't do that. I mean, they're going to come to private land and then they're going to go, well, what's going on? I mean, if we could have had these talks before wolves were ever on the ground and actually helped the state agency as well get prepared, I think we would have had a much better turnout right now. So I'm a little nervous, I guess, about the future of ranching and wolves in Colorado and CPW's ability to like really move through this in a positive manner that will be beneficial to them as well. I hope the best for them, but yeah, I mean, it's like it sounds like Colorado ranchers, there's a question here, available free money for.
Go ahead. Yeah, I'm also looking at the chat. Meanwhile, I have a question from Lexi a little while back that says,
Yeah.
your work, well, first compliments, it appears very labor intensive. Can you talk about your team, how they support you, and also like how many packs and ranchers are you able to help?
Yeah, so again, this is all dependent on funding. We could help a lot more if we had more funding, so it's always just dependent on that. My team I mean, we do a lot of volunteering time. We've had some support, so we can offer this service again free to the ranching community so that they can actually have that whole thing taken off of their shoulders in a way. And that, again, we're trying to eliminate conflict. So first of all, I guess thank you for the kind words, Lexi. It is super labor intensive. It takes a special kind of person. I get a lot of people that want to ride off into the sunset, and it's nothing like that. It's not nearly as romantic as one would hope. But for the right person, it's working with a system that's much bigger than yourself and creating solutions for something that's much bigger than yourself. And that's a reward in its own right. So with that being said, I'm really trying to take steps to ensure that range riders that I work with and that are a part of Project Griph don't go through the hardships that I've faced before. That we can actually make this a livable job. I don't want to hire somebody for 5 months and hope they come back next year. I mean, that's going to leave a lot of turnover. I want to put a lot of effort into creating a solid range rider, and then make sure that they come back every year. For one, I think that's going to make the communities that we work with and that we embed ourselves with, and they're going to be way more comfortable, dealing with that same person every year. I mean, to have a turnover rate that they're dealing with a new person every year about a subject that's so controversial and so sensitive, that's not going to help. So it just depends. Like, I've worked on, to kind of answer your question, what does that scope, what does that look like? Real quick story. It's not what we apply, it's how we apply. There was a case where I was riding in an allotment that was 30,000 acres, 2 packs of wolves. I was the only human. I had my 3 Dobermans and my horses, and we had no issues. And then that same gentleman actually ranged another federal grazing land allotment that had 7 range riders, 1 pack of wolves, and about like a little over 20,000 acres, and they were losing cows every night. So the way that I operate, the methodology that I utilize and developed over the years, that offers a much different look on the landscape to what's actually happening, which also then equates to a different outcome, a different solution. So, I mean, when you have tons of resources going in, you have 7 range riders in there, and you're losing cows on a nightly basis, that's a point where I would say that we need to really re-examine where and why and how we're using our funds. And maybe there's a better way, because we have this person over here that's applying it this way, and we're not having any problems with twice as many wolf packs. So, I think that might answer your question, Lexi. Please let me know. Let's see. There's one more part here, though. How many ranches? I mean, yeah, it just depends. Like there's a corridor that I really want to work on here in Washington that we could offer help to over a half a dozen ranchers that have experienced chronic conflict, that you wouldn't need that many range riders if we actually had that corridor of cooperation where their ranches nestled right next to each other, that we can actually spread the impact and that effort a little bit more. But yeah, how big do you imagine your program can become? With the proper funding, I think we can really revolutionize how wolves interact with the rural America in the West. So, like I said, if we took that funding that we just reimbursed for all these depredations, and not even, it sounds like as many that we've experienced here in Washington sometimes, we could have prevented that, and that could have changed dramatically the outcome for where we're at now in Colorado. So.
So how, just connecting that to, how can people support you?
Yeah, so basically the best way to do that, I mean, funding is a huge way if that's something that's not really available to you. We've had one intern. The nonprofit was just founded last year. We had our first intern. So there's help like that. We always are looking at potential volunteer opportunities and how that can actually impact in a positive way our work. So if that's something that you want to do, I'm wearing many, many hats right now, and some of them I don't know how tight I can pull them if they're going to fit. One of those is fundraising, marketing development, social media, things like that. So, I mean, there's always a way. The best way to do it is to reach out. If you go to like the bottom of this webpage, if you can't donate, you want to find out another way that you can help contribute, you could just email us at the link at the bottom there and open up a dialogue and find out how we can kind of help each other. There's a lot of skills that a lot of people possess that I don't. Very quick learner, very good at learning, but yeah, there's a lot of hats that I'm wearing right now. So yeah, please, if you're interested in participating in that in any capacity. Another option is so the for-profit business that I ran for over 12 years, the first and still only non-lethal human wildlife mitigation business in Washington, we started offering act rides. I'm a acronym geek. Griph stands for guarding the respective interests of predators and humans. That's the name of the business. So ACT rides, that stands for Active Conservation Tour. So come out in the front lines with me. I'll take you out on horseback. It's an all-inclusive trip. You stay out, in wolf territory with me. We might interact with them. We might hear them. We might even see them. But either way, you're going to be helping. You're going to be out there. You can meet the ranchers that I'm working with. And that ticket that you buy actually helps us in a very impactful way because you're paying directly us to be out there for that day with you. And then I'm paying another range rider again the next day. And then we're also paying that rancher time for his or her input, their opinion, their outlook on what it's like to actually live with wolves in your front yard. So that's another really good way if donation's not not as nitty and gritty as you want to get. Well, come out here and join me on the front lines. So
Will you learn how to howl when you join tours like that?
yeah, that's an extra fee, but we are fine to to incorporate that. These howls don't come for free, guys. These come on now.
Maybe people's howls will attract wolves more than the
There you
children.
go.
But,
Or I don't know. I mean, I've heard some people howl, Judith, and I think those wolves would turn tail and run. So that's
Yeah.
like it just depends on who's howling, I suppose.
Deborah Taylor has another a methodology question.
Yeah.
Can't you provide the wolf packs that attacked cattle with easier game prey?
I can't really provide them because that would be almost me putting that on the landscape. But what you can do is what you're doing, these animals are perfect risk to gain managers. So they're looking at what do I get and how much does that cost me? And they're looking for that kind of ratio. I get a really good meal and I have a very little chance of getting hurt. So what we can do, and that's basically in essence what cattle are on the landscape if there's no protection. It's an easier prey base. That gain goes up. We call them slow elk. I mean, for a reason. So that gain goes up, that potential gain. And if there's nobody there to actually watch, or if that person's there once a week because they're off doing other duties in another county, that leaves a loophole. So that risk goes down dramatically. So now the gain's up here and the risk is really low. They're going to switch to that prey base. So what we do as range riders for Project Griph is we try and stack up the risk so high that the risk is, the gain is still here, but the risk is well above that gain. Like every time you go into that herd, you're going to get potentially chased out, or you're going to get shot in the butt with rubber buckshot, or you're going to have, some light deterrence, above you. So any way that we can basically make that seem way scarier and way not worth it, that's what we need to do. So what that does is that it naturally allows these animals to go, okay, well, that's not working. We got to go back to what we know. And what they know is natural wild ungulates, and they will switch back. I mean, or they will just maintain on that prey base because they're looking for the path of least resistance. We always have to remember that. As humans, as animals, whatever we are, we're primarily water, and how water navigates and operates on this land and in this world is it takes the path of least resistance. So you got to imagine if it's super easy to go hunt a cow, well, there's no reason not to. They're going to continue to do that. And that's just what's going to happen. If you make it really hard to hunt that cow, they're going to go, well, we still need to eat. So there are these deer, and there's no protection for the deer except for their natural defenses. So that's the best way to deal with that. Does that answer your question?
I hope so, Deborah. I have another question from Michelle. Given your success, why are the state agencies not helping to fund your program or help you expand your operations?
For usually political reasons. That is like there's two organizations, I'm just going to be frank, in Washington right now that are being funneled money for political reasons. I actually was approached by the state though this year to write some proposals to scale this up. The unfortunate part is that, there's been a lot of budget cuts lately, so there's not a lot of available opportunity monetarily. But I think at this point right now, at least in Washington State, they realize that, that was a really bad year last year. We actually this year went lethal in January for the first time since wolf recovery. So it's not a great step forward. So I think that's why I was like, well, we need some help. Which was a weird conversation, right? Like, can you write me a budget? Can you write me a proposal for a $0 budget? It's like, yeah, I can write you all the proposals in the world, but if there's no money, we can't do a damn thing. So, I think right now with the current with the current administration and what they're doing with the government, I think what it'll do is actually make private entities and these private services become even more critical, because the opportunity and the availability of what help they could have attained, which already, I mean, I've talked to a lot of ranchers that aren't getting calls back from the state agency. That's only going to get worse. So that only makes it even more critical and more important that, you know, entities like Project Griph step into place and take a lot of that effort and run with it. And I think that's a beautiful notion, though, because that will help bridge that gap, I think, even more than just state funding or federal funding. So
Yeah, I guess it's similar in Colorado. We have some questions from Deborah. Deborah, do you just want to go ahead and unmute?
Yeah, I can. But then I got to open up what I sent. I've sent a lot of questions. I was asking one, how bad is CWD in Washington State? And I mentioned that almost half of Colorado's combined elk and deer hunt allotments have CWD within the herds now.
yeah.
And have you spoken with the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project people about seeing if you can access some of their funds or get the approval of them to have Colorado Parks and Wildlife use some of their funds for you to do some training here?
Okay, so how bad is chronic wasting disease in Washington? It's not horribly bad, but we are seeing more cases of it come up. And that's something that we have to remember. Wolves, you know, they offer that sanitation effect. They're hunting much differently than how humans hunt. They're hunting for the easiest prey base. Again, path of least resistance, so they're going for that easy target, and that's actually what ends up cleaning out a lot of these herds and eliminating some of those sick and injured animals that do spread diseases like chronic wasting disease. So it's not surprising when you have the largest ungulate population in the US being Colorado, and then no apex predator for a while, that we're going to see diseases run rampant through those. I mean, that's like when I remember doing a talk for Rotary meeting up here years ago, and there was a guy that's like, well, what about all these, you know, the ungulates they're gonna eat them out of extinction. And it's like, well, no, they've evolved on the landscape for well longer than we've been here. And if that was the case, that they were going to eat all the ungulates, for one, we wouldn't see wolves anymore. And we'd only know of ungulates from their fossil records. And that's just not the case. We actually have open hunting seasons everywhere wolves are right now. So we need to kind of re-examine that logic and stop managing for human-centric purposes. We have to stop doing that, I think. So anyways, the last question, have you spoken with the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project about accessing? I have reached out and haven't heard back from them.
Okay, well, I'll write my contact there too. Thanks.
Yeah, no, not a problem. Thank you for the questions, you guys.
Yeah, we've got 5 more minutes. Who's got any other questions for Daniel while he's here online?
Reiner's got one. I can see it in his eyes.
Hi, Daniel. I'm just exhausted
Hey,
from
Reiner.
2 days meeting with CPW and then with the state legislator to not amend the current proposed law to include science in the I guess, wildlife management mandates in Colorado. So, I mean, there's many questions. The basic question is why did Colorado tell the ranchers they would not have to mend their ways when wolves are on the ground? And why did ranchers kind of bait wolves almost and then get hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensation after?
Yeah, that's a shame. I think that's the first question from my gut off the cuff response would be politics again. I think politics govern our natural world way more than what it should, unfortunately, when really we could probably just solve these issues with, you know, a good general dialogue without all that nonsense being in there. I think that when you, again, like when you're a rancher and we're putting a lot of these, you know, like non-lethal responsibilities in their hands, it's hard for them to get behind that. Psychologically, it's hard for them to get behind it physically. So, I mean, you have to wonder, were they baiting those animals in by having that carcass pit uncovered? Were they just ignorant? Was there no support? I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there. I would have loved to have seen a different approach to that scenario. I think that to then compensate for that, though, that's not really good. Now you've just set a precedence that now I mean, you won't ever go backwards on that. Now the next rancher is going to go, well, I want my $300,000, and we already broke your compensation effort budget in the first round, and now we have 15 more wolves in the ground. And that was just when there's a smaller amount, and
Well,
you know,
plus it penalizes the ranchers who actually do want to coexist with wolves and know that they can. So it's
well, and what that,
around
yeah, Reiner, I
everybody.
think that's a really good point that he just hit on. It doesn't even just penalize them, it forces them to look at it in a different light too. They're like, well, shoot, those guys were trying to work with them. They didn't even get any help. They just ended up going through the ringer, and then they get reimbursed. So they're either going to do that, or they're going to take matters into their quote unquote own hands, most likely, because again, there's not that third party service that can really jump in there and help bridge that, and help navigate that complicated terrain. And I mean, if you would have had a Project Griph Range Rider there, for instance, Rainer, they would have said, hey, this carcass pit needs to be covered up, man. We're happy to do that for you. We're happy to do that, but this is only going to attract these predators. That's only going to lead to conflict. But since that wasn't done and now they've been reimbursed for that, I don't think that's a real good step forward.
Well, we tried, so we're still working on it. So maybe at some point in the not too distant future, in a far, far galaxy,
Yeah.
a different world, maybe we'll get it done.
No, I know, and I think that's what we have to do is keep trying. And I mean, the moment that I can get something established in Colorado, I would like to, because I know that there's community members out there that really want the help, and if they don't get it, they'll just kind of be put in the corner, like you said. So
Yeah, I mean the problem is, as you mentioned, this is political. It's the human element in
yeah,
anything called wildlife management, and if we can get politics eliminated to some extent, I think we have a good chance of making it work. With
yeah,
politics involved, and I saw it today again in full bloom, it's just not much of a chance.
yeah. And that's the sad thing is now you're dealing with that kind of the situation that you're in now. Like if we would have been able to make different choices prior to this, I think we'd be having I think we'd all be a little bit less stressed, and we'd have more money in the coffers to actually do a better job in a bigger landscape. So, but I think, commend all you guys on sticking into it. So
Yeah,
I'm still trying myself.
we're not giving up. So Deborah is
Oh, no.
Deborah is part of this effort, and we got a bunch of other people. So we will prevail at some point.
Yeah.
I think one of the main issues you mentioned at the end of your 8-minute documentary was people and nature are getting so separated. The city dwellers don't know what nature is anymore,
Yeah.
and that is just a mentality that is very dangerous, and we all need to change that, basically.
Yeah.
A whole new discussion. I think if anyone wants to share anything for the end, but I would highly suggest to watch that documentary again with better sound and a better video than I was able to provide. And please check out Daniel's website from his nonprofit to see how you can support him and what else he's doing. Maybe it can inspire people to become a range rider as well, or at least a wildlife advocate. Do you want to share anything else, Daniel, before we say goodbye?
I can't think of anything. I'll probably think of a bunch of things that I want to after we could disconnect. But no, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, Judith. And this is a subject that I think we all just need to kind of take a step back and really examine and find out, best way forward. So yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity to talk to, you guys here in Colorado. That's a beautiful state. I have family and friends there. I've spoken to a lot of ranchers out there, and there's definitely a want to move forward. I mean, we had that event in Carbondale, and it was, they really they want some help. So hopefully we can get that to them.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for your time and sharing your story. And it's just very inspiring to see someone who's so solution minded. And yeah, we will need to move forward and find solutions for this coexistence or co-thriving.
Yeah. Let's move beyond just existing. Let's actually start living
Let's
much better.
co-thrive.
Yes, exactly. So, Well, thank you guys.
Thanks everyone for joining. And I've recorded it, so I'll post it on our YouTube channel, and everyone can watch it again.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much, Judith.
Awesome. Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye, guys.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.